Some legends don't vanish, they just step into the quiet. Harrison Ford hadn't flown a mission in years, but one morning in Wyoming, a single misunderstanding was all it took to set something bigger in motion. No warnings. No headlines, just an old man in handcuffs, and a courtroom about to be reminded who still watches the skies. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills of Clearwater, Wyoming, casting a soft orange glow across the small town's only park. Folding chairs lined the field. A podium stood at the edge of the makeshift stage, draped in a faded American flag. Locals gathered in quiet reverence for the 10-year memorial of the Great Forest Fire, a tragedy that had nearly wiped the town off the map. 12 lives had been saved that day. No one ever knew the name of the pilot who flew the last run through the smoke and flames, guiding a failing rescue chopper down a narrow ravine and vanishing without ceremony. But everyone remembered the miracle. In the back row, an older man sat alone, weathered jacket, jeans, and a faded cap pulled low. He didn't stand when the mayor spoke. He didn't clap when the names of the survivors were read. He just watched. Eyes steady, still. A few people glanced his way, vaguely unsettled by how familiar he seemed, like someone they'd seen in a story they couldn't quite place. No one approached. After the ceremony, while most filed toward the reception tent, the man walked away quietly, without drawing attention. A dusty pickup waited near the edge of town. Instead of leaving, he turned toward a dirt road marked Clearwater Gun Club, members only. The sign creaked in the wind. He drove through the gates like he'd done it 100 times before. Inside the small clubhouse, a young man barely out of college sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. He looked up as the stranger entered. "Morning," the man said, his voice calm, low. "You got a membership card?" The kid asked, distracted. "No, just here to pick up something left years ago," said it'd be held in storage. "Name?" "Let Ford." The young man checked a logbook, found nothing. "You got ID?" Ford shook his head. "Just came from the ceremony, thought it'd be here." "Well, without ID or a match in the log, I can't let you access anything." "Sorry, sir." Behind the counter sat an old storage cabinet marked "Clearance, Unclaimed." Ford's gaze flicked toward it. The clerk noticed. "You saying it's in there?" Ford didn't answer. He stepped closer. The kid shifted, nervous. "Sir, I need you to step back. I'm calling the sheriff." Ford didn't resist. He simply turned, walked to the far wall and sat on a bench, folded his hands, waited. The sheriff arrived 12 minutes later with a deputy in tow. "We got a call about a man trying to claim a weapon without ID," the sheriff asked. The clerk pointed. "That's him," said. "His name's Ford, tried to access the cabinet." The sheriff approached. "Sir, can you provide identification?" "No." "Do you have any paperwork proving ownership?" Ford's response was the same, steady, unapologetic silence. "We are gonna have to ask you to come with us." Ford stood, hands visible, no protest, no words. The deputy moved to cuff him. Ford offered his wrists like it was nothing new. From the doorway, a teenager with a phone out captured the moment. An old man in cuffs, escorted out of a gun club by 2 armed officers. The clip hit local feeds within an hour. "Unknown armed suspect detained at Clearwater Gun Club." Comments flooded in. Most were confused, some angry, others recognized him sort of. "Is that Harrison Ford?" one user posted. "No way, looks like him but older." Back at the scene, the sheriff loaded Ford into the cruiser. As the door closed, Ford looked past them all, not at the officers, not at the phone recording, but at the tree line beyond the parking lot. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring something only he could see. Beyond the trees lay the same ravine from a decade ago. The smoke was gone, but something in the silence said it wasn't over. He wasn't there to retrieve a weapon. He was there to remember, and maybe to make sure he still could. Some legends don't vanish, they just step into the quiet. Harrison Ford hadn't flown a mission in years, but one morning in Wyoming, a single misunderstanding was all it took to set something bigger in motion. No warnings. No headlines, just an old man in handcuffs, and a courtroom about to be reminded who still watches the skies. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills of Clearwater, Wyoming, casting a soft orange glow across the small town's only park. Folding chairs lined the field. A podium stood at the edge of the makeshift stage, draped in a faded American flag. Locals gathered in quiet reverence for the 10-year memorial of the Great Forest Fire, a tragedy that had nearly wiped the booking room at the Clearwater Sheriff's Department hadn't seen real action in years. 3 holding cells, 1 fingerprint station, 2 tired fluorescent lights, and a sense that most trouble here involved speeding tickets or the occasional drunken fight after high school football. That made the man in cuffs, stoic, silent, refusing to give his name, feel like something from a different world. Deputy Ellis typed slowly, watching the man through the glass. "You sure he didn't give you anything?" He asked the arresting officer. "Just said his last name was Ford. No ID, no license, no weapon registration, just a notebook." The notebook now sat in a sealed evidence bag on the counter. Ellis pulled on gloves and opened it carefully. Inside were rows of hand-drawn grids, numbers, coordinates, some circled, others with faint X marks. On the last page, a faded weather chart, annotated with notations that looked military. Ellis frowned. "What the hell is this?" The sheriff leaned over. "Looks like flight path mapping." Ellis nodded slowly. "And this," he pointed to a smudge in the corner, "smells like aviation fuel." In the holding cell, Harrison Ford sat calmly on the bench. No slouching, no pacing, just breathing in that slow, practiced rhythm like he was still in the cockpit. Hands folded, eyes open, watching. They ran his fingerprints. Twice. The screen came up blank, not flagged, not suppressed, just empty, as if the man had never existed in any civilian system. "That's not possible," Ellis muttered. "Everyone S in the system, DMV, IRS, VA something." Sheriff Dalton scratched his chin. "Unless he was military, deep clearance, shadow file." Ellis gave him a look. "You think we just cuffed a spook? I think we better stop assuming we know what we're looking at." A younger deputy, Martinez, brought in a tray of water bottles. As he handed one through the bars, Ford took it with a nod. As he drank, his jacket sleeve slipped slightly. Martinez noticed a narrow, pale scar running along the shoulder, precise, diagonal, like a surgical line, but slightly jagged at the edges. "You take a bad fall?" Martinez asked casually. Ford didn't answer. Martinez pressed. "I saw one like that on a guy who used to rappel from helicopters," said the line snapped mid-descent. Ford's eyes met his, calm, steady, then he looked away. Back in the squad room, Ellis reviewed the security footage. The camera in cell 2 ran on a continuous loop, grainy but clear enough. He watched the old man sit quietly, never moving much. Then something subtle caught his eye. Ford had checked the overhead camera, once when they closed the cell, again during the second hour. He seemed to measure the angle with a glance. Later, he paced the cell in precise steps, twice the length, once the width. He glanced at the vent, the wall seams, the screws in the bench. Not frantic, not nervous, methodical. "He's casing the cell," Ellis whispered, "but not to escape. He's analyzing it." The sheriff leaned over his shoulder. "Looks like he's testing our security, seeing how we run things." Ellis didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Sheriff, if he's one of ours, we might have just cuffed someone we were never meant to see." Meanwhile, in the cell, Ford leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, not asleep, not relaxed, just waiting. He'd triggered the system on purpose, and now he was watching to see who responded. The Clearwater County Courthouse hadn't seen a full crowd in years. The wood-paneled courtroom, with its creaky benches and faded portraits of long-retired judges, usually handled noise complaints, property disputes, and the occasional DUI. But that morning, something felt different. Locals trickled in after hearing that yesterday's arrest, the old man from the gun club, was being arraigned. Most expected a quick hearing. A misunderstanding, maybe. Still, the gallery filled. Some came out of boredom, others out of curiosity. A few came because they sensed something bigger was happening. At the defendant's table, Harrison Ford sat quietly in an orange jumpsuit, wrists chained to a belt at his waist, ankles shackled. He looked ahead, unmoved, as if the room didn't exist. His public defender, a man who'd clearly been handed the case that morning, shuffled papers with visible frustration. No name, no background, no cooperation. "Your Honor," he said, "my client has refused to identify himself, which has limited my ability to prepare any defense." Judge Marilyn Keller, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, glanced over her glasses. "Has the defendant spoken at all?" "Only once. He said his name was Ford. No first name, nothing else." The judge sighed. "Very well, proceed." The clerk began reading the charges: possession of an unregistered firearm, failure to present identification, possible violation of federal firearms regulations. Ford didn't move. The gallery leaned forward. Then the doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, crisp and alert. They moved with quiet confidence, like people used to authority but trained not to flaunt it. One approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'm Agent Milner with the Department of Homeland Security. We're requesting immediate transfer of the defendant into federal custody. We believe he may be connected to an ongoing matter involving national security." Judge Keller raised an eyebrow. "You believe?" The second agent stepped forward. "We have reason to suspect that the individual in custody may have classified affiliations. His presence here compromises operational integrity." The judge did not respond immediately. She leaned back in her chair, weighing the moment. From the second row, a retired Marine in full VFW attire stood and whispered, "That man's not some threat. I saw the way he moved, military for sure, but not the kind that hurts people, the kind that saves them." Before the judge could answer the agents, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom burst open. This time, no one spoke. A man entered wearing the full-dress uniform of a United States Air Force general. His chest bore rows of medals. His posture was upright, eyes forward, expression unreadable. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The silence in the room deepened as he walked down the center aisle, each step deliberate. One by one, military veterans in the gallery rose to their feet. No command, no coordination, just instinct. Even the judge straightened her spine. The general reached the bar, nodded respectfully to the judge, then handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. Without a word, the bailiff delivered it to Judge Keller. She broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and began reading. Her face changed. First confusion, then recognition, then something harder to place, an understanding that she was no longer in control of what was unfolding. After a long pause, she looked up. "In light of this classified correspondence from the Department of the Air Force," she said, voice level but tight, "this court is compelled to suspend all proceedings effective immediately. All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed." The agents from Homeland Security stepped back without a word. Judge Keller continued. "The individual known as Ford is to be released into the custody of General Callahan under the full authority of the United States military." A collective murmur rippled through the room. The general turned to face the courtroom. "What happened here today will not be discussed publicly. There is no press release, no statement. The matter is closed." The bailiff moved to unlock Ford's restraints. For the first time, Ford stood without hesitation. He looked at the general, nodded once, and then he spoke. "Apologies for the inconvenience, sir." The general's reply cut through the air. "On the contrary, the Air Force apologizes to you." At the word, "sir," several members of the gallery, especially those in uniform or with military backgrounds, snapped to attention. Even the bailiff straightened. The man in orange was no longer anonymous. He was something else entirely, not a suspect, not a criminal, but someone above the system, someone the system wasn't meant to question. Judge Keller held the letter for longer than anyone expected. The courtroom had gone silent, not from fear, but from the weight of something unspoken. She read every line twice, then a third time. Her expression shifted with each pass, first confusion, then recognition, and finally the grave look of someone realizing she was no longer the highest authority in the room. She set the letter down carefully. Her voice was quieter now. Not shaken, but measured. "This court," she began, "has received classified communication from the Department of the Air Force, signed by Major General Callahan, Commander of Strategic Domestic Operations." She paused. No one moved. "According to this document," she continued, "the individual presently in custody, identified only as Ford, is an active operative assigned to a national emergency civil defense network. His operations are classified under Title 10 and Title 50, Joint Jurisdiction. His presence here is the result of a deliberate deviation from protocol undertaken for reasons not disclosed within this document." She looked up, her gaze shifting from the two Homeland Security agents to the public defender, then finally to Ford. "In light of this documentation, and under authority granted by the National Defense Authorization Act, all charges are immediately dismissed. Mr. Ford is to be released without delay." No one clapped, no one cheered. The weight in the room was too heavy for that. General Callahan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue commands. He simply looked at Ford and said, "Sir, we are here to take you home." Ford stood slowly. His movements were calm, unhurried. The chains at his waist were unbuckled and set aside by the bailiff with newfound care. For the first time since his arrest, Ford spoke, not to the room, just to the general. "Apologies for the delay, sir." General Callahan met his gaze without blinking. "On the contrary," he said, voice firm but respectful, "the Air Force apologizes to you, Mr. Ford." That was when it happened. The veterans in the gallery, Marine, Navy, Air Force, stood in unison. Some saluted. Others simply bowed their heads, not because they were told to, because they knew. The public defender, speechless, took a step back as Ford moved past him without a word. The two federal agents turned away, saying nothing. At the rear of the room, Sheriff Dalton watched it unfold with narrowed eyes. He didn't understand all of it, not yet, but his instincts told him what he'd suspected since the moment Ford was brought in. This wasn't about a gun. This wasn't about a man refusing to give his name. This was about something that had nothing to do with the town, or the courtroom, or the badge on his chest. It was about a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Ford walked beside the general toward the rear exit. As they passed the wooden benches, someone whispered, "He planned this, let himself be seen." Another voice answered, "Yeah, but why?" Outside, the sun had shifted behind the courthouse. Shadows stretched long across the lawn. In the distance, a government SUV waited with its engine running. Ford paused just before reaching the steps. He turned, not to look at the crowd, not to make a statement, but to glance once more at the courthouse doors. He hadn't stumbled into this situation. He had walked straight into it, on purpose, to see who was still paying attention. The auditorium was small, windowless, and quiet. Located deep within a restricted section of Edwards Air Force Base, it held no press, no banners, no camera crews waiting outside. Just 40 chairs, occupied by men and women in uniform, and a few select civilians who had been quietly invited. The podium stood plain and unadorned. At its base, a table held a single medal resting on a dark velvet cushion, its ribbon deep blue, the medallion gleaming under the overhead lights. At precisely 900, General Callahan stepped forward. No preamble, no dramatics, just words spoken with weight. "Today," he said, "we recognize a man whose name does not appear on any wall, who has never accepted a headline, and who once declined the Medal of Freedom because, in his words, that was never the point." He paused, letting the silence settle. During Operation Fireline Echo, an unprecedented wildfire cut off a civilian camp in the Teton Range. 12 people, including 2 children, were trapped without communication, surrounded by terrain unreachable by ground or standard air units. The temperature exceeded 110 degrees. Visibility dropped below 50 feet. Flight Command had ordered a stand down. No one else was going in. The general looked toward the front row, where Harrison Ford sat in full civilian attire. No ribbons, no insignia. Just a clean white shirt and eyes that did not flinch, but someone did. He nodded. Ford volunteered to take a modified Bell 407, no sensors, no copilot, through a burning corridor with less than 10 meters clearance. He made 3 passes, pulled out all 12. Barely had enough rotor control to land, then walked away without filling out a single report. A murmur rippled through the room. Respect, amazement, some disbelief. The general gestured. "Mr. Ford, please." Ford rose, moved to the front with the same calm, deliberate pace that had become his signature. He didn't look at the medal. He didn't speak. He simply nodded to the general. But before the general could pin the commendation, a young officer in the 3rd row stood up. "Permission to speak, sir." Callahan nodded. The young man stepped forward. Early 30s, lean build, special tactics badge on his sleeve. He looked at Ford for a long moment. "I was one of the 2 children in that camp," he said. "Back then, I didn't know who you were, I still don't, but you flew through fire to get to us. I've trained for 12 years to reach the level you demonstrated in a single day." He turned to the room. He didn't just save our lives, he gave them direction. Ford finally looked at him, no emotion on his face, just a slight nod. As the general moved to pin the medal, another officer near the back leaned over to whisper to his colleague. "Did you know?" he asked. The other shook his head. "Only after the alert. When Ford triggered the arrest, we recognized the call sign buried in the system logs. Took 2 of our own to flag it. 2 operatives, both former civilians rescued from Fireline Echo, both now embedded in national security. They were the ones who sent the warning. They were the ones who made sure the general arrived on time." As the applause died down, quiet, controlled, respectful, a young recruit near the door asked the question on everyone's mind. "Sir, if you knew they'd arrest you, why not just tell them who you were?" Ford didn't hesitate. "Because sometimes," he said, "silence serves the mission better than recognition." And with that, he returned to his seat. The medal still in its box, unclaimed, but never unearned. Detective Aaron Wells sat alone at his desk long after the rest of the sheriff's department had gone quiet. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The case file lay open in front of him. Harrison Ford, unknown background, no digital footprint, arrested at the gun club, released without charges. He read it again for the 5th time, even though he knew the details by heart now. There was something about it that didn't sit right, not in a bad way, in a way that made him feel small. The phone rang, not the department line, his personal cell, unlisted. He stared at it for a moment before answering. "Wells." A calm voice came through, older, precise. "This is Colonel Rains from Strategic Domestic Operations Command, under the Department of the Air Force." Wells sat up straighter. "Yes, sir, what can I do for you?" "You were the arresting officer during the Clearwater incident involving Operative Ford." "Yes, sir, I was." A pause. "Mr. Ford has submitted a recommendation to place you into consideration for an upcoming civilian-military liaison program. It's a selective assignment." Wells blinked. "Wait, he recommended me." "He did, but I arrested him." Another pause. Then, with no irony in the voice, the colonel replied, "Exactly." Wells stayed silent. The colonel continued, "Your actions were by the book, no shortcuts, no assumptions. You treated an unknown subject with protocol, not prejudice. That's rare, and it's what we need." Wells rubbed his forehead, trying to take it in. What would the assignment involve? "You'd be trained to identify, interact with, and support field operatives working under non-traditional cover, people like Mr. Ford. UD work alongside military units, but as a civilian bridge. A trusted interpreter between worlds." "Is this official?" "Not yet. It begins with one question. Do you want to serve in a way most never see?" Wells looked back down at the file. The grainy still from the holding cell camera showed Ford sitting on the bench, arms folded, eyes closed, not asleep, just waiting, like he knew this moment would come. "Yeah," Wells said finally, "I think I do." "Good," the colonel replied. "You'll receive a sealed packet in 48 hours. Read it alone. Follow the instructions exactly." The line went dead. Wells sat in silence, the phone still pressed to his ear. Outside his window, the Wyoming night stretched wide and empty. But something in it felt different now, like the horizon had moved. He glanced back at the file one more time. He had cuffed the man. Now that same man was opening a door, not in spite of the arrest, because of it. The warehouse didn't look like much from the outside. Just another shell of metal and dust on the edge of a forgotten industrial park in northern Nevada. But inside, it had been converted into a temporary command post. Screens glowed with live drone feeds. Whiteboards showed connection maps, code clusters, and call intercepts. A dozen operators, most of them under 30, paced between stations, arguing over variables and probability trees. They were smart, sharp, and restless, and they were stuck. The target was a cybercriminal cell operating under military-level encryption and strategic movement. Every time the team thought they'd found the nerve center, it vanished. Safe houses were empty, servers wiped clean, surveillance yielded shadows but no faces. That morning, General Callahan had made a phone call. By midday, Harrison Ford walked in. No announcement, no uniform. Just jeans, boots, and a canvas jacket zipped to the throat. He didn't shake hands, didn't ask for a sitrep. He simply walked the perimeter, slowly, hands behind his back, eyes moving from monitor to monitor. No one knew what to say. He stood beside one analyst staring at a satellite image of 3 potential sites. Ford didn't speak, just tilted his head slightly, then moved on. At the shooting range set up behind the command post, 2 field agents were calibrating angles for a possible breach scenario. Ford watched in silence, then adjusted one of their stances with a nudge to the shoulder and a look. It took 4 hours before someone finally asked the obvious. "Are you here to run the op?" Ford looked at him. "No." "Then why are you here?" "To see what you're missing." He said nothing else. By sunset, the team had run through every known tactic, pattern analysis, signal triangulation, kinetic simulations. Still nothing. A young intel officer named Price stepped outside, frustrated. "This is pointless," he muttered. "We are chasing ghosts." Ford stood nearby, leaning against a railing. "You're not chasing ghosts," he said. "You're chasing your own assumptions." Price blinked. "Sir." Ford pushed off the railing and walked to the center of the command floor. Everyone watched. He looked around the room, not judging, just present. "You keep thinking they're hiding," he said. "Building bunkers, disappearing." He tapped the map showing the 3 suspected sites. "But what if they're not hiding at all?" Silence. "What if they're watching you?" Confused looks spread across the room. "You've been circling these 3 sites for days. You think they're patterns. Maybe they're mirrors." He pointed to the least likely location on the board, a condemned office building with no heat signature, no recent movement, and no intel hits. "That's your target." One of the field commanders shook his head. "We already cleared it." "No," Ford said. "You swept it." He stepped back. "You missed the 4th floor." There was no 4th floor listed. The room exploded into motion. Analysts ran to check permit records, floor plans, archived blueprints. One found it, an unregistered renovation 12 years prior. The 4th floor had been built illegally, sealed off, and never documented. Thermal imaging was dispatched. Within minutes, faint heat signatures lit up the screen. Static, small, controlled, too controlled for amateurs. They had found it, not by signal, not by code, but by perspective. Later that night, after the site had been secured and the operation declared a success, Price approached Ford outside by the trucks. "How did you know?" Ford didn't answer right away. He watched the sky, then looked at the young man. "You were looking for people trying to disappear," he said, "but people like that don't disappear." He tapped his temple. "They embed, they blend, they wait for you to get too clever, then they walk right past you." Price nodded slowly, understanding now what training never taught him. Ford didn't stay for the debrief. He had seen what he needed to see. They weren't perfect, but they were starting to see differently. The fog rolled in thick that morning, settling low over the tree line and clinging to the gravel at Clearwater Gun Club like it didn't want to let go. Frank Sullivan unlocked the front gate just after 600, same as he had every day for the past 15 years. The air smelled like damp pine and spent brass. Familiar, steady, the kind of morning where nothing should happen, but something did. She was already there, young, early 20s maybe, ball cap pulled low, hoodie zipped. Moving alone in lane 6, the same lane he remembered Ford taking months ago. Her stance was quiet but disciplined, left foot slightly forward, shoulders square, she didn't flinch, didn't rush, every motion smooth and deliberate. She wasn't just shooting, she was studying. Frank watched from inside the clubhouse, coffee in hand, unsure if he should approach. She adjusted her aim without touching her scope, tilted her head slightly, winded a breath, pulled the trigger. The shot cracked low and clean. Paper target, 200 yards out, center mass. She fired again, same rhythm, same result. It wasn't just the accuracy, it was the method. She was reading the wind with her skin, not her gear, timing each breath like it was part of the weapon. By the time Frank walked out to greet her, she was already packing up. "Nice grouping," he said casually. "Thank you," she replied, polite, no smile, just acknowledgement. "College team?" he asked, like he always did when someone this young shot that well. "No," she said, tightening the straps on her rifle case. He hesitated, watching her hands. The way she coiled the sling, tucked the cloth, kept everything compact. Efficient, familiar. "You've shot before," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small folded note from her jacket and placed it on the bench beside her gear. "He told me this was a good place to practice," she said. "Said you'd understand." Frank picked up the note after she left. Plain paper. No signature, just one line. He said I should train here, that some people know how to watch without being seen. Frank stared at it for a long moment, then walked back inside, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and pulled out the old card. The one Ford had left behind, still tucked between pages of a worn field manual. Same card he hadn't touched in months. He flipped it over. On the back, in Ford's handwriting, were the words he'd never forgotten. "Some of us are always around, you just don't see us." Frank looked back out at lane 6. It was empty now, but not silent, because once you've seen someone like Ford, you start to notice the echoes. The girl, her form, her quiet. She was Ford, but she was the next ripple, and maybe that was the point. Some people pass on their names, others pass on their discipline, their silence, their way of seeing. Frank placed the new note beside the old one, locked the drawer, and went back to the range, because someone had to be there, watching. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.